There's 4 ways in which you can spend money. The first is that you spend your own money buying something for yourself. Now, in this case, you've got a strong incentive to get the best price you possibly can, and there's a good expectation you're going to end up with something that you actually want. Secondly, you can use somebody else's money buying something for yourself. You're going to end up with something that you want, but you're a little bit less incentivized to be careful with how much you spend. Thirdly, you could spend your own money buying something for somebody else. It's less likely that you'll get them something that they really want, but you're incentivized to be careful with your money. Fourthly, you could spend someone else's money buying something for somebody else, in which case, as PJ O'Rourke said, who gives a shit? Economics is all about incentives and knowledge. If you think about profit, in January 2008, ExxonMobil announced record profits of $40 billion. The reason why this was big news at the time was because there was a lot of public outcry. And I think that the reason why there was such outcry was people were focused on profit in terms of its incentive function. People were wondering whether or not Exxon executives needed to be motivated by so much profit, whether or not we could expect a society where people would do good things without having to receive such profit. Now, incentives are important, and profit serves as an entrepreneurial discovery mechanism. So this is important. However, one of the main reasons that economists emphasize the importance of profits in the market economy is not just incentives, it's also knowledge. Knowledge is a signal to mobilize resources. So when ExxonMobil make $40 billion, this isn't just rewarding previous entrepreneurial discovery, it's also a signal to the rest of the marketplace about where resources need to be coordinated. So what's the signal of a $40 billion profit? 1, we need to conserve existing oil. It's telling everybody that we need to be more careful and use less oil. 2, it's a signal to search for new oil for countries that maybe don't have as much oil exploration to think to themselves, do we have some oil? Can we tap into these high profits? 3, to find substitutes for oil. So it's a very strong pressure for everybody to think, what can we use instead of oil in order to try to reduce the costs that we're spending, given that oil now is so much scarcer and driving such profits. This is one of the main important things. When we think about socialist economies, the incentive function is very important. We think, why would we be incentivized to do so much time and effort to create goods and services if we're not receiving so much benefit? But we don't need to focus on the incentive function. We can also focus on the knowledge function as well. The ideologists of the Communist Party sought to eradicate cultural diversity by inducing a change in the character of the citizens of the Soviet Union. So-called New Soviet Man would demonstrate selfless collectivism and enthusiastically spread the socialist revolution. In this view, the incentive problem was solved because there would be a fundamental change in the nature of man. People would be motivated to do the right thing. This would solve the incentive problem, since people would instinctively act in accordance with the greater good. And indeed, propaganda was such an important tool to change the fundamental nature of man. See famous posters that say things like, build like you would for yourself. The problem, though, is that even if there's a transformation in man, even if there's a transformation in human nature, this doesn't solve the economic problem of knowing how to allocate resources. Maybe the ExxonMobil executives don't need to create such high profits in terms of satisfying their own entrepreneurial discovery, but they do need to make such profits so that the marketplace receives the signal about where resources are becoming relatively scarcer and where we should be looking for new opportunities. Vlad Tarko said, shortly after the 1917 Russian Revolution, Ludwig von Mises made a dramatic argument: top-down socialist management of an economy with the purpose of increasing the efficiency of resource allocation relative to a capitalist market economy is literally impossible. The Austrian School of Economics became one of the most dominant schools of thought at the time because they pointed out the impossibility of rational socialist planning. If we define socialism as the public ownership of the means of production to advance material prosperity, which was the original intention of socialism wasn't to have a fairer economic system. It was to have a better, stronger, more efficient economic system. The stated goals were to increase prosperity, to have a more efficient use of resources, to eliminate business cycles, to eliminate monopoly power, and to have a more equitable distribution of wealth that was being created through more rational central planning. As Mises said, socialism is the abolition of a rational economy. The exchange relations between production goods can only be established on the basis of private ownership of the means of production. Rational economic activity is impossible in a socialist commonwealth. His argument rested on a fundamental issue between 3 things. At the basis is the private property system. So by definition, A communist system or a socialist system is abolishing private property in the means of production. Mises pointed out, though, that private property is a necessary prerequisite for economic exchange. Economic exchange is what provides the prices that we need to coordinate resources. So that knowledge function of the profit and loss system fundamentally rests on an economic exchange which rests on private property. Without private property, there's no means of production in terms of a marketplace for the means of production. If we don't have exchange, there's no relative prices that reflect relative scarcities. If we have no market prices, then there's no rational economic calculation about how we can use scarce resources to best serve alternative consumer demands. This is what's known as the socialist calculation problem, shifting emphasis away from whether or not people are incentivized to do the right thing to whether or not we have sufficient knowledge to be able to best allocate resources in a complex economic system. Now, people responded to this. So the original aim of socialism was to have this more rational economic system. Market socialists recognized Mises and Hayek's views at the time. Oscar Lange said, but what if planners can simulate market competition and use computers in order to solve all of these simultaneous equation problems? This was the early rise of computing power, and people thought this would be a solution to the criticisms that the Austrian school were making. Is the socialist calculation debate merely an accounting problem which can be overcome through better planning? Can we use mathematics, and at the time there was major advances in mathematics, to solve this complex issue with the rise of quantitative macroeconomics? But the Austrians responded to this. Mises and Hayek were well aware of these arguments and these counter-arguments. They said even if planners had perfect technical knowledge over the institutions of market process, only the institutions of the market process can reveal the knowledge that's required to assess the alternative uses of scarce factors of production. For example, as Pete Becky says, in the absence of markets, how do planners know which goods to produce and which production techniques are economically feasible? Tyler Cowen says, without having access to market prices to evaluate the opportunity costs of resource use, socialist planners could not tell which outputs should be produced or how to produce them. When it comes to economic value, the socialist planner is literally like the blind man groping in the dark. Mises said, economic calculation requires private property. Without it, we are taking steps in the dark. This brings us to Hayek's contribution to the debate and the importance of the knowledge of time and place. He made a distinction between scientific knowledge, which is knowledge of general rules, and the knowledge of time and place, which is the facts of your immediate surroundings. This is the special knowledge of circumstances, of the fleeting moment that's not known to others. Hayek said, the practical problem arises precisely because the facts are never so given to a single mind, and because in consequence, it's necessary that in the solution of the problem, knowledge should be used that is dispersed among many people. The knowledge in the economy is spread wide amongst multiple individuals, simply impossible to congregate that knowledge into one central planning agency without the institutions that allow that knowledge to be created and distributed. The price system can draw on each person's local and often tacit knowledge to effectively produce goods and services without collecting that information in one place. A market economy doesn't rely on information all getting centralized to be able to have decisions made. The market economy allocates scarce resources in a decentralized system, therefore produces knowledge that simply doesn't happen in a socialist system. The main difference here is that where Oscar Lange and others thought that this was fundamentally a computational problem and therefore could be solved through better computers and better use of simultaneous equations, Hayek argued that this was an epistemic problem. It was a knowledge problem, not something that can be solved through technology. This, to some extent, turns some textbooks on their head. Really, we have a continuum, not necessarily two completely separate economic systems, socialism and capitalism. It's not the case that Russia, for example, was a fundamentally different system than we see in the United States. Really, there's a continuum between rational calculation and arbitrary political discretion. We either have political authority coordinating resources or we have the market economy. And the Austrians point out that the market economy is the only rational basis to know where resources should be moved. We can view the Soviet system in this sense as a heavily regulated, rent-seeking society that's not fundamentally different to what was happening in other countries. Pete Becky said, the Soviet system is best characterized as a market economy dominated by monopoly producers subject to vast and arbitrary government intervention. It brings these economic systems into the same realm of economic analysis. The implications, therefore, are relevant for all countries. This isn't a mere historical claim about two rival economic systems from the past. The main choice is not between planning and not planning. It's between what type of planning we want, whether we want central plans, whether we have decentralized plans. Hayek said, this is not a dispute about whether planning is to be done. It's a dispute about whether planning is to be done centrally by one authority for the whole economic system or is divided among many individuals. In the Soviet Union, the knowledge problem became endemic. For example, there was a memo that's reported by Ryszard Kapuscinski in his book Imperium. The memo said, transfer the sewing machine belonging to the tailor's shop number 1 to factory number 7. And that memo was signed by Joseph Stalin. Can you imagine a system where the leader is making such specific directives? Some companies today probably operate on similar lines. During this period, the claim that Russia industrialized is somewhat mistaken. During the 1930s, the USSR didn't really industrialize. It emphasized on increasing production in heavy industry for the purpose of building arms. It was more a case of militarization than industrialization. As Martin Mahler said, contrary to the declared goals of the regime, it was the opposite of a system of production to create abundance for the eventual satisfaction of the needs of the population. It was a system of general squeeze of the population to produce capital goods for the creation of industrial power, in order to produce ever more capital goods with which to produce still further industrial might, and then ultimately to produce armaments. It's not like the United States economy where production was used to serve the benefits of the consumer. On the contrary, consumers were being used to serve the benefits of the production for military armaments. Following Stalin's death in 1953, the objective became even more explicit about prioritizing military strength ahead of consumer goods and ahead of high living standards. According to Victor Sebastian, every factor which made industrial products like cars or electrical goods was required to have a military application too, and could quickly be converted to war footing. This was the point at which communist leaders gave up the pretense that their economic system was intended to deliver advanced material wealth for the general population. It was clear by this point that this was not happening. During this period, the military sector accounted for around 25% of GDP and upwards of about 75% of R&D spending. Interestingly, the attitude of central planners towards military production supports the view that socialist calculation is impossible. If we're saying that it's impossible to adequately plan things using a socialist model, what explains Russia's military strength during this period? Partly it was because military production was organized in a very different way to the rest of society. Samuel Pisar said, the military sector is the only sector in the Soviet economy which operates like a market economy, in the sense that consumers pull out of the economic mechanism the kinds of weaponry they want. The military, like consumers in the West, can say, no, that isn't what we want. Weapon production faced open competition from the United States, whilst domestic production did not. So fighter planes were a higher quality than washing machines because they were subject to competition and because the end user, the military, were able to give feedback as to whether or not the models were what they wanted. This also demonstrates why it's wrong to use the military strength of a country as a means to infer the underlying standards of living. In some countries, their military strength is a reflection of general wealth and abundance. In other countries, their military strength is coming at the expense of general wealth and abundance. The main problem in the Russian economy, in the Soviet economy, and in communist economies generally, is the problem with measuring output. A famous cartoon joke that the manager of a nail factory was given an award for beating his production target, which was measured by weight. The famous joke is that they produced a 1-ton nail. The Soviet Union wasted its resources because the success indicator for Soviet managers allowed them to be successful, even though their output was poorly related to the needs of users. Now, the 1-ton nail is kind of meant to be a joke, and some people refer to it, maybe they're not sure, they're not aware that it's meant to be a joke and they think it was literally the case. The basic principle on which that 1-ton nail rests, though, is quite accurate. According to Macmillan, rewards were based on measured output. Glass was measured based on the number of square meters produced. Cutting corners to assume they met their quotas, glass factories would make glass on plates so thin they often broke before even being installed. Steel output was measured by the ton. The fastest way to make a ton of steel plates was to make them thick, so the steel factories made them so thick that they were unusable. The productivity of car manufacturers was measured by the number of cars produced. Not surprisingly, lots of cars were produced, but they didn't run very well. During this period of Russian growth, we were expecting them to overtake the US economy. Many economic textbooks were actually saying that it was only a matter of time before the Soviet machine would overtake American standards of living. Western academics continued to overestimate the productive capabilities of the Soviet Union till well into the 1980s. It seems quite remarkable now that when you look at the Paul Samuelson textbook, he would say that it would take maybe between 20 and 33 years until the Soviet economy would overtake the American economy. Different editions of his textbook failed to take account of the fact that this simply wasn't happening. One of the main problems was that this wasn't genuine growth being experienced by the Soviet economy. It was what economists refer to as catch-up growth. Paul Krugman said, Stalinist planners had moved millions of workers from farms to cities, pushed millions of women into the labor force and millions of men into longer hours, pursued massive programs of education, and above all, plowed an ever-growing proportion of the country's industrial output back into the construction of new factories. Still, the big surprise that once one had taken the effects of these more or less measurable inputs into account, there was nothing left to explain. In other words, Soviet growth was almost all perspiration and no inspiration. It was all about putting more resources into the inputs of production. It was about getting as much output as possible from the factors of production without unlocking the secret of economic growth that Western countries had established, which is how to get more from doing less. This was common across the globe. Across the 20th century, economics was about planning. At the time, in the mid-1950s, 1960s, the USSR was seen as a viable alternative. In the United States, there was a heavy emphasis towards regulation. In the UK, there was a heavy movement towards nationalization. Planning was everywhere. We can see this in the development economics literature, where the most prominent models in development economics were infant industry arguments and neo-Keynesian growth models. These were resting on the same basic principles that made people think that Russian industrialization was a strong factor in their increased dominance, and why countries like the USA and the UK needed to find their own versions of planning. But this Soviet growth was an illusion. There was initial growth, sure, because it started from such a low base. But since it was purely technical growth, diminishing returns very quickly kicked in. This is in stark contrast to the United States, which was engaged in genuine innovation, which was an endogenous growth that meant that sustainable growth was occurring year after year after year. Ultimately, rising living standards are about consumption, not production. The advance in prosperity is not about inventing new ingredients, but about creating new recipes. And whilst Soviet growth was based on increases amounts of ingredients, US growth was about better quality recipes. We see lots of criticisms of capitalism. There was a tweet recently where somebody posted a picture which said, "Capitalists will literally open a portal to hell instead of going green." The irony of this was that the portal of hell that was supposedly open was part of Mexico's nationalized gas company, and communists did actually open the gates of hell. The Soviet Union started a gas well fire in Uzbekistan that burnt for 3 years, severe enough that they eventually decided to use a 30-kiloton nuclear warhead to seal the wellhead. A few years later, they used a larger bomb to seal another blowout nearby. And you can still see gas fields in Turkmenistan that are ablaze because of the environmental destruction caused by communist planning. If your main concern is the environment, recognize that communism has been a terrible impact on the environment. The state has been a big polluter. According to official government figures from Slovakia, in 1980, 45% of the 3,500 kilometers of rivers were dangerously polluted. 80% of well water was unsuitable for human consumption. East Germany banned the publication of pollution levels because they knew the results were so bad. The desiccation of the Aral Sea is probably one of the biggest environmental disasters of all time. Famously, the town of Bitterfeld, which is 110 miles south of Berlin, is one of the dirtiest, most polluted country in the world. It was the capital of East Germany's chemical industry, a place where towering smokestacks released plumes of bright yellow, jet black and hazy brown smoke, a total of more than 15 times the East German average of sulfur dioxide and dust. Also in Hungary, in the late 1980s, air pollution exceeded international standards by 40%. It was implicated in one of 17 deaths. Hungary had one of Europe's worst life expectancy rates. The Danube was unswimmable. and less than half the population lived with an adequate sewage system. According to a Guardian article, many of the threats to the river's health are part of the legacy of communism. Soviet bloc regimes promoted heavy industry, including the mining of bauxite, uranium, and gold, and placed large oil refineries along the waterway with scant heed for the environment. Now, communism was doomed to failure from the start. According to Norman Davies, whether as totalitarian rivals or as ideological opposites, fascism and communism lived off each other in an all-European monster duel. Once fascism was dead, the death of communism was only a matter of time. The situation under communism, according to Catherine Belton, was as follows. The free choices of capitalism and the drive for profit in the West were fueling a boom in technological development. By comparison, the planned socialist economy of the Eastern Bloc was frozen far behind. Its enterprises were bound only to meet annual production plans, its workers and scientists left to procure even the most basic goods through informal connections on the great market. Isolated by the Iron Curtain, smuggling became the only way for the Eastern Bloc to keep up with the rapidly developing achievement of the capitalist West. So we could ask, why did it last so long? If rational economic planning is impossible under a socialist commonwealth, why did communism last as long as it did? We can think of a few reasons. One is that many of these countries, Russia in particular, had immense natural resources, so that helps. Secondly, they borrowed quite a lot of money. Thirdly, parasitic pricing. So the fact that there was a global economy that was producing information in the form of market prices helped some socialist commonwealths to be able to benchmark and use those global figures as a means by which they could coordinate their activity. We said that socialist planning is like groping in the dark, but the global marketplace is shining spotlights in various places, and that can help. Perhaps another reason, though, maybe even more importantly, why communism lasted as long as it did, was informal market activity. So this is sometimes known as tolkachi, which can be translated as pullers. But this is essentially the informal economy where we see that even when we have a centrally planned economic system, the marketplace still emerges. It's possibly the case that the emergence of that underground market is what allowed the system to survive as long as it did. Ultimately, black markets enable resource allocation. So the state may be trying to create a central plan, but it can't always direct what the public are doing. There's an episode of Friends where Rachel is famously a bad waitress and she'll bring the drinks orders to the group and she will always get it wrong and forget who's had what. The critical thing, though, is that once she's delivered all of the drinks to the wrong people and she's turned her back, all of those people will then swap the drinks so they end up with the thing that they wanted in the first place. We can see this as a nice analogy for the communist system where the state miscoordinates resources, but then enterprising, energetic, entrepreneurial individuals then try to fix that as best they can and ensure that the system can potentially survive. There were black markets in rent where people would post advertisements and messages around towns. You could see informal activity in terms of product markets. Photos from the 1950s show people buying cabbages at local markets where farmers sell their surplus. You can see photos of pensioners that spend their time weighing people in the park, picking a little supplemental income. In the late 60s, black marketeers, or chevakovi, began to set up underground factories in which spare parts and materials that were siphoned from state-owned plants were used to produce goods outside of the regulated economy. So this was an incredibly important underground system that was allowing resources to be allocated somewhat in line with consumer demands and where the information was. You might think that the regime would clamp down on this. So the question is, why were these black markets allowed? There's probably two main reasons. One was that insiders benefited from them. So many of the central planners themselves were benefiting from the underground black market. But secondly, necessity. So without allowing these black markets, there probably would be mass starvation and the system would collapse. So if this was the price to pay for the continuation of communism, people felt like it was a good deal to make. Christian Michel said, the message was given to turn a blind eye to the black market. Andropov knew the country was otherwise headed for mass starvation. A good example of some of this discoordination comes in the market for shoes. According to Scott Shane, some of the longest lines in Moscow were for shoes. At first, I assumed that the inefficient Soviet economy simply did not produce enough shoes. For that reason, even in the capital, people were forced to line up for hours to buy them. In fact, at the time, the Soviet Union was the largest producer of shoes in the world. It was turning out 800 million pairs of shoes a year, twice as many as Italy, 3 times as many as the United States, 4 times as many as China. Production amounted to more than 3 pairs of shoes per year for every Soviet man, woman, and child. The problem with shoes, it turns out, was not a shortage. It was a far more subtle malfunction. The comfort, the fit, the design, the size of the Russian shoes that were being made were so out of sync with what people needed and wanted that they were willing to stand in line for hours to buy the occasional pair, usually imported, that they actually like. Again, it's not a technical problem with communism. It's an economic problem. We know how to make shoes. There's no problem with being able to make shoes. But what we don't have is the knowledge of what type of shoes people actually want to buy. The knowledge problem was still endemic right up until the end. To quote Mikhail Gorbachev, during the final years under Brezhnev, we were planning to create a commission headed by the secretary of the Central Committee, Kapitonov, to solve the problem of women's pantyhose. Imagine a country that flies into space, launches Sputniks, creates such a defense system, and it can't resolve the problem of women's pantyhose. There's no toothpaste, no soap powder, not the basic necessities of life. The fact Gorbachev used the women's pantyhose example is particularly interesting. Chris Summers was a 22-year-old Briton who sold factory machines in East Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union. He claimed that the only reason why Gorbachev was aware of this problem with women's pantyhose was because his wife had been complaining about it. This then became part of a 5-year plan and led to the demand for Western manufacturing equipment. This was how dysfunctional the economy was, that it was the wife of the leader that would be complaining about a specific consumer product in order to get that into a 5-year government plan, which then created the demand for people like Chris Summers to go over to East Germany and to sell these machines to try to help fix the problem of women's pantyhose. For every consumer good like women's pantyhose that were being fixed top down as part of the new 5-year plan, there was all sorts of different consumer goods that were simply being neglected. In 1989, Boris Yeltsin went to visit a grocery store in Clear Lake in the United States. He was 58 years old at the time, and he, quote, roamed the aisles of Randall's, nodding his head in amazement. He told his fellow Russians in his entourage that if their people, who often must wait in line for most goods, saw the condition of US supermarkets, there would be a revolution. Yeltsin asked customers about what they were buying and how much it cost. He later asked the store manager if you needed a special education to manage a store. In the photos that were published at the time, you can see him marveling at the produce section, the fresh fish market, and the checkout counter. He looked especially excited about frozen pudding pot. Even the Politburo doesn't have this choice, not even Mr. Gorbachev, he said. When he was told through his interpreter that there were thousands of items in the store for sale, he simply didn't believe it. He even thought that the store was staged. It was a show just for him. Little did he know that there were countless stores just like it all over the country, all full of goods and services available to the general public. So why did the Soviet system collapse? We know that it was doomed to fail from the start because it was the absence of rational economic planning. We know that black markets and other factors made that it was allowed to continue for some time. I think there's two reasons why it collapsed and why it collapsed when it did. There's a nuanced reason and an obvious reason. The nuanced reason why the Soviet system collapsed was because of a change in leadership. There was an important relationship in the leadership style between the ideologies of Thatcher and Reagan and Gorbachev. There was something about the way they saw the world that meant that they were aligned in being able to try to recognize some problems and how they might be able to fix them. This nuanced reason for the collapse of communism essentially blames Gorbachev. It claims that Gorbachev was a fundamentally decent guy, perhaps very, very naive. And that was in strong contrast to previous Soviet leaders who were evil. Previous Soviet leaders were willing to incur massive costs amongst the public to maintain the system. Gorbachev was not willing to make such costs, and his fundamental decency of trying to reform the system is what led to the system collapsing. There's also a more obvious reason why the Soviet system collapsed, though, and that's bankruptcy. There was three main reasons why the Soviet system was bankrupt and why it collapsed when it did. The first was the war in Afghanistan. The second was Star Wars. The third reason, low oil prices. When it comes to Afghanistan, Mikhail Suslov said, "We simply cannot afford another Afghanistan." The Afghan Communist Party had come to power following a coup in 1978. The USSR had then defended it against a Mujahideen insurgency. They invaded Kabul in December 1979, but were unable to maintain territory in the provinces. They suffered 2,000 casualties, which was more than all other post-World War II fighting, by December 1981. The USSR attempted to hand over to Afghan forces and then finally withdrew in February 1989. This was an incredibly expensive engagement, also damaging to Russian pride, prompting the end of the USSR. Second main reason was Star Wars. After World War II, the USSR became involved in an arms race with the Western world, mostly the United States. This was a classic prisoner's dilemma, where both sides would rather have not had to invest in the resources to battle with each other, and yet it was rational for each of them to participate in the arms race to avoid the other getting a head start. Over the decades that had followed, both sides accumulated enough weapons to destroy the world several times over. In 1983, Ronald Reagan announced the SDI project, which was nicknamed Star Wars. It was an ambitious attempt to create a missile defense system in space. Some people claim this wasn't even a genuine, sincere plan. Some people even claim it was a bluff. But it escalated the cost of the arms race so much that the USSR was essentially forced to surrender because it simply couldn't carry on contributing. The US were outcompeting the USSR on defense spending, despite devoting just 5 to 10% of GDP, as opposed to the Soviet Union spending 10 to 20% of GDP. Because the United States was generating so much more economic growth, it had a lower proportional bill, but that was contributing to a massive net amount. Third main reason for bankruptcy was the oil crisis. So September 13th, 1985, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the Saudi Minister of Oil, announced that they would increase production. This prompted the oil price to collapse. The Soviet Union lost around $20 billion per year. By 1989, Gorbachev needed a $100 billion loan from the West to survive. Political concessions that he made were a prerequisite for this necessary loan. This led to a massive increase in USSR government debt. So why did Eastern European communism unravel? In Eastern Europe, communism unraveled essentially because Gorbachev decided to give it up. Gorbachev's long-term objective was to reach further arms limitation agreements with America, to massively reduce Soviet defense spending, and then obtain huge loans from the US to prop up the Soviet economy. He was prepared, if it came to the point, and it did, to dismantle the outer empire in order to achieve those goals. That's in the words of Viktor Sebastien. Gorbachev believed that glasnost and perestroika were necessary means to save communism in the Soviet Union. He couldn't afford, and he didn't have the ideological desire to continue to support Stalinist dictatorships. This falls back on the theory that Gorbachev was a fundamentally decent person rather than a fundamentally evil person, and was therefore just simply not willing to use force to prop up those dictatorships. At the collapse of communism, the average American worker had a material lifestyle that the average Soviet worker could scarcely even imagine. It was not just that an American construction worker could own a car and a house. It was that he could shop in the supermarket that seemed to have more food on the shelves than all of Moscow. That's in the words of Scott Shane. In an article published in 1991, Abraham Bergson pointed out that the USSR was supposed to have achieved the abundance of material and cultural goods for the whole population by the 1980s. That was the stated intention of the adoption of communism in the first place. This would have then allowed the government to finally usher in the long-promised higher phase of Marx. We can say that the Marxist principles hadn't been adopted because Russia was going through a system that was a necessary prerequisite for that. But that was supposed to have delivered sufficient material abundance to bring in that latter Marxist stage. But it didn't happen. By the mid-1980s, consumption in the USSR was at the lower levels experienced in OECD nations. There was an economic reason why the central planning system simply didn't deliver the material production that they required. We can see this most clearly with the German natural experiment. John Kay has pointed out that there was one great controlled experiment in economics. It began 50 years ago when one of the world's most successful economies were divided into two zones. In one, there was a powerful central planning agency able to assess needs and coordinate production plans. In the other, people were just left to do pretty much whatever they wanted. The country in which the experiment was conducted was Germany. And a few years ago, he's writing in 1997, the results came in. 1/3 of the way through, it was necessary to build a wall to keep the experiment going. Otherwise, the inhabitants of one zone would mostly have fled to the other. The end came when they tore down the wall and fled anyway. It's difficult to be exact, but most observers agree that living standards in the West were at least twice those of the East by that time. As Robert Heinbrenner famously admitted, the contest between capitalism and socialism is over. Capitalism has won. The lesson seemed pretty clear to everybody. I'll give you a quote of somebody who was in East Germany at the time. There was a period in my life when I studied the theories of Marxism and Leninism, and I found them interesting, and like many of us, logical. But as I grew up, the truth became ever more clear to me that these theories are no more than fairy tales. Communism vividly demonstrated its inaptitude for sound self-development, dooming our country to steadily lag behind economically advanced countries. It was a road to a blind alley, far away from the mainstream of civilization. The entrepreneurial class should become the basis for the flourishing of our society as a whole. That was a quote of Vladimir Putin. However, as Christian Niemczyk has argued, socialism is the failed idea that never dies. And despite the seemingly clear victory in 1989 of capitalism over socialism, this argument continues to remain. Books published most recently, such as The People's Republic of Walmart and Thomas Piketty's Time for Socialism, demonstrate that we've never really escaped this fundamental dichotomy. Jack Ma, the founder and chairman of Alibaba, in 2016 argued that big data introduced greater prospects for central planning. He said, over the past 100 years, we've come to believe that the market economy is the best system, but in my opinion, there will be a significant change in the next 3 decades, and the planned economy will become increasingly big. Why? Because with access to all kinds of data, we may be able to find the invisible hand in the market. The planned economy I'm talking about is not the same as the one used by the Soviet Union or at the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic of China. The biggest difference between the market economy and the planned economy is that the former has the invisible hand of market forces. In the era of big data, the abilities of human beings in obtaining and processing data are greater than you can imagine. With the help of artificial intelligence or multiple intelligence, our perception of the world will be elevated to a new level. As such, big data will make the market smarter and make it possible to plan and predict market forces so as to finally achieve a planned economy. Others are talking in similar terms. We see terms now like techno-socialism, cyber-communism. Will big data see a return to central planning? I don't think so, because these are the same old arguments. Pete Boettke and Rosalina Candela said, it's neither dispersed nature of knowledge, nor even the different judgments of different entrepreneurs that is the critical factor in the Mises-Hayek framework. It is that the knowledge utilized in the market process is contextual and fleeting. The social outcome of techno-socialism therefore requires that AI has information that only emerges as context-specific knowledge from entrepreneurs competing as residual claimants for property rights in the means of production, and being subjected to market feedback from consumers in the form of profit and loss. If you don't have that profit and loss system that's built on the bedrock of private property relations, then we don't have the information that big data would need. They go on to say, the knowledge problem that Mises, Hayek, Kurtzner, and Lavoie identified is not solvable through advances in AI and modern computing. The knowledge of the market is not dispersed as bits and pieces throughout the economy that must be collected and computed to guarantee the efficient allocation of resources. Rather, the intellectual division of labor and the division of knowledge in society is contextual, embedded only within a division of exchangeable private property relations. Such knowledge of time and place, where entrepreneurs reside, and in the socially embedded processes of exchange and production activity, only emerges within the competitive give and take of the marketplace. Outside of that context, the required knowledge does not exist. As Mises said all that time ago, we're taking steps in the dark. Fundamentally, there's a choice between two economic systems. We either have incoherent central planning, or we have a rational market economy. The closer we are to the rational market economy, the greater material advances we have at moving resources to their most efficient use to satisfy the multiple demands of consumers. The further away from there we move towards the incoherency of central planners, the more we're the blind person groping in the dark. If you think that distinction maybe is a bit too binary, I'll just finish with the words of Stephen Kotkin. What he said was, well, you can't be half a communist.